Good afternoon. Welcome to Spy Chat. I'm Amanda Olkey, Director of Adult Education at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us. Today, our Executive Director, Chris Costa, is joined by Elizabeth Sizeland, former UK Deputy National Security Advisor and Prime Minister's Advisor on National Resilience and Security in the Cabinet Office. Beth is a non-resident senior fellow at the Scowcroft Strategy Initiative of the Atlantic Council Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. She has accrued over 20 years of national security experience in the UK government, and her areas of expertise include security strategy and policy, countering state threats, investment security, cybersecurity, national resilience, serious and organized crime, counterterrorism, and crisis response. Prior to working as the United Kingdom's Joint Intelligence Organization attaché here in Washington, Beth held the position of Deputy National Security Advisor and as advisor to the UK Prime Minister on intelligence, security, and resilience issues, working closely with her counterparts in the United States. Beth has also held roles as a Director General at the UK Government Communications Headquarters, a Director in the UK Home Office, and a Director for Transport Security for the UK Department of Transport. Prior to that, Sizeland worked in the Cabinet Office briefing room and has held operational and analytical posts focused on a wide range of international issues. After Chris and Beth discuss the issues that are catching their attention, we will turn it over to you for your questions. If you've been with us before, you'll know, please write them in the Q&A. I wish we could get to all of them. I have a feeling we're going to be bombarded today, but we will do our best. And the fastest way to get to the questions is for me to go away and turn this over to Chris.
Thanks, Amanda. Great introduction. It is so wonderful to have Beth join us today. This is a milestone for Spy Chat because this is the first time we've had a foreign partner join us for a Spy Chat. Now we're going to have an Israeli former Mossad officer next year, but I'm particularly excited because Beth and I connected not too long ago, and we realized we work the same counterterrorism problem. Her in London, me in Washington. We never really met or knew each other until we shared part of our story. So Beth, it's wonderful to have you. Thank you very much. There's a lot going on in the world, so I'm going to dive right in. No surprise. The first story I want to talk about, the headline from Washington Post, is early stages of Israeli ground assaults in Gaza. It's shrouded in secrecy. So we know that Israel has moved into the second phase of their military operations in Gaza. There's a lot of secrecy. There's a lot of gray surrounding that operation. That's certainly justifiable in light of operational security concerns from an Israeli standpoint. All that said, it seems that what's happening is Israel has divided Gaza into essentially north and south, and they're focused on encircling Gaza City in the north. That's my analysis, that while they're doing that, they're executing probing operations. They're looking for tunnels. Some 130 plus tunnels have been discovered according to different media accounts. There's close quarter combat. The Israelis have lost a number of troops in these operations. And one of the terms that I've seen in multiple news outlets is this idea of using the term gradualistic, that this is very incremental in terms of slow is fast. The maneuvers are intended obviously to go after Hamas operators on the ground, terrorists, as well as Hamas infrastructure. So It seems that they're eliminating the Israelis' pockets of resistance, and it's very incremental, and it ties back to that term gradualistic. Now, we don't know what the new security reality is going to be in Gaza, but continue to monitor what is happening. You'll know as well as I do as this thing continues to play out, but the United States clearly has voiced in opposition to the idea that Israel will occupy Gaza. We'll see how this plays out. But short term, this particular article in these headlines are very much related to a second phase of Israeli military operations ongoing in Gaza. And that plays into something we talked about, so I'll be brief. The headline is how years of Israeli failures on Hamas led to a devastating attack. We've discussed this in the recent spy chat that we have, and we're certainly willing to address from our seat where we think some of the shortfalls have occurred. But clearly, there's a recognition that Israelis' intelligence services failed to predict the scope of the October 7 attack. The causes of that have been attributed to political turmoil on the ground in Israel, meaning polarization, as well as too much focus on Iran and Hezbollah and strategic thinking anchored on the idea that West Bank political violence was Hamas's focus to instigate problems there versus what we saw take place on October 7th. And the last piece is very interesting, and we'll segue to the next article, and that's the idea that American intelligence services have largely stopped focusing on Hamas for a period of years. So that really segues into the headline that I want to flag in the Wall Street Journal, which said U.S. all but stopped spying on Hamas after 9/11. And there have been many detractors that have come out and said that the United States should view this as a significant intelligence failure. My argument would be, look, post 9/11, the United States focused on Al-Qaeda, then ISIS. The United States had finite resources, and Israel has, for all intents and purposes, really had a very good understanding of what was happening on the ground in Hamas. So this has clearly surprised the U.S. intelligence community. But as one counterterrorism official was quoted in the Wall Street Journal saying that it was a well-placed bet. With finite resources, you have to make critical decisions in terms of where you're going to focus your intelligence resources. So I'm not in a position here of defending the U.S. intelligence community, but I understand that the United States has to make decisions based on a finite level of resources and an infinite possibility in terms of threats that the United States has dealt with in terms of counterterrorism, not to mention great power competition. So that's how I will address that. So to change gears a little bit, the counterintelligence story that should resonate with Beth as well, that got my attention, is the press conference that took place with Five Eye leadership from Australia, Canada, New Zealand, of course, UK, the head of MI5, talking again about what we heard Director Ray speaking about here at the Spy Museum in September, and that is China's objectives to target the Silicon Valley and to steal technology secrets. In fact, Mike Burgess from Australia, from the Australian Intelligence Service, Security and Intelligence Organization, said China was going well beyond what a normal intelligence service would do in terms of their prerogatives for conducting espionage operations. And it's interesting that Mike Burgess said that, because he's been to the Spy Museum, he's done podcasts with Dr. Hammond, and we have talked to him about these issues. So it's fascinating to me that all of the Five Eye leadership spoke about China's malign behavior in terms of stealing secrets. And they chose to execute that discussion out in the Silicon Valley. Also, I should note that there was a 60-minute segment that talked about it as well that really got my attention. All right, from a counterterrorism standpoint, also no surprise, as a result of the Israeli-Hamas war that's ongoing, or Israel-Hamas war, the director of the FBI, Director Wray, has also said the current threat is at historic levels in terms of where it emanates from as a result of this war that's ongoing. In other words, Jewish communities have to be concerned about full spectrum threats coming from homegrown violent extremists here in the United States, and also jihadists coming from, of course, radical Sunni extremists, as well as Shia organizations that want to target Jewish community centers and other targets of interest. And what's fascinating about this is, since Director Wray has talked about that, just in the last 24 hours, Brazil has reported that they foiled, along with Mossad, an attack that was being planned at Jewish targets on the ground in Brazil. And you might recall, just a few spy chats ago, I believe I talked about in the 1990s in Argentina, there were Israeli targets in a Jewish community center was attacked by Hezbollah. I should mention that it's early in reporting, but the media has suggested that this is a Hezbollah-linked plot in Brazil. That shouldn't be surprising to our audience. We've talked about Hezbollah's worldwide capabilities. The last story I want to flag is, of course, about hostages. We always talk about hostages and wrongful detainees here. The headline is U.S. Qatar to revisit Doha's ties with Hamas after the current crisis. So the theme of the Washington Post article is there's been an acknowledgement that after the United States and Qatar and Israel and many other countries get through this crisis, the United States and Qatar will talk about hosting Hamas political leadership in Qatar. All of that said, my point of view on this, and you're going to have the opportunity, hopefully, to read about this in an article that I hope gets published next week in The Hill, where I talk about the relationship with Qatar and how important the channel to Hamas is for the ongoing current hostage situation. But I think that is good diplomacy, setting aside this discussion while the United States, Israel, Egypt, and many other countries are using the Qatar channel to Hamas to try to resolve the current hostage crisis. So the last thing I want to do, and that was a lot, right, is I want to talk about my recommendation for professional reading. I am really excited about a very sobering book that I'm almost done with, Target Tehran, How Israel is Using Sabotage, Cyber Warfare, as well as assassination and secret diplomacy to stop a nuclear Iran and create a new Middle East. That's a mouthful, but it's an excellent book. And actually, the Wall Street Journal did a very favorable book review some time ago about it, but I highly recommend it. Spy Museum sells it. You can find that book. So that's an awful lot. I'm going to turn it over to Beth to hear from her.
Oh, thank you very much, Chris. And I'm really delighted to be your first foreign guest on Spy Chat. It's a brilliant podcast, and I love it. So it's as a fan joining in, that's a really nice thing. And thanks also for that sort of list of what's going on. It feels like a really very busy time, doesn't it, on the national security risk agenda? And really, you offered some really amazing insights on both the IDF operation and the hostages. And I've probably not got a huge amount I could add to your analysis on that. But there were a couple of the articles that really caught my attention that you sent through were on the intelligence failures, both on the Israeli side and also the article that you mentioned about US intelligence posture. And I thought I would just sort of offer a few thoughts on that, because I think it is, as you say, really clear that the Israeli system as a whole underestimated the strategic threat from Hamas. You know, they've misjudged the strategic intent they have had to attack Israel, the sophistication capability of Hamas to plan quite a complex operation over a long period of time, and also underestimating what has appeared to be a really horrifying and violent set of tactics against an undefended civilian population. So we are not going to find out in really short order all of the details that sit behind this. You know, it's going to have to be a slow and reflective professional process over time, and I think it's important that you know, we give the space for that to happen. And I also want to say, you know, Israel is not on its own in misjudging strategic risk like this. It's very common, more common than we as national security professionals would hope. Even in really sophisticated state apparatus like we have in Israel, the UK, and the US. I mean, you need only look back at the last 20 years to see the range of inquiries and commissions that have sought to understand why we have underestimated things like Russia's regional aggression, why we've underestimated the terrorist threat in some regards. And, you know, recently, even the sort of speed of the fall of the Afghan government, for example, you know, these are all probably, if we look back, we can see some indicators there, but as systems, we haven't kind of filtered to the right judgment on that. And I think it's not surprising in many ways, and you can see, if you look back at commissions and inquiries, some categories, broad categories, I think, of reasons for that. Firstly, intelligence gaps, and the article you sent through kind of alludes to that, and that can be because either you have taken resource choices about what you are seeking to collect, but it could also be because you're frustrated in your attempts to collect that information. I think one element that is usually kind of overlooked in the sort of immediate aftermath is how complex government systems work and how information and intelligence is held and shared or not in these sorts of situations. And there can be all sorts of inhibitors, whether they are security or even technology or institutional barriers, that can mean that when you look back, there are often some quite valuable pieces of information that are in the system, but just are not in the right place to be understood in their correct context. And then there's assessment itself, which, as you know, Chris, is an extremely complex, nuanced process and very subject to kind of human approaches, and that can affect the ways in which we look at the jigsaw picture of information, and is prone to all sorts of weaknesses like optimism bias or normalcy bias. And it's possible that in this case, some of those judgments have been based on a status quo without kind of sufficient challenge to that. And as you say, this is all taking place in such a complex political context, and against a very broad threat surface in Israel as well, that it's going to take some time to sort of unpick all of that, I think. And then just on the US intelligence coverage point, I mean, so I'm sort of perhaps slightly more feisty on this than you, Chris, and I don't think the way that the US posture is characterized in that as sort of outsourcing, I think the term was in the article, is very helpful or reflective of the kind of professional consideration that goes into these processes. So as somebody in the UK that had responsibility for shaping national intelligence requirements, I think I've kind of almost scrubbed through the point I wrote here because you said it verbatim. Resources are finite. You have to make proportionate risk judgments about where to place your bets, if you like. I think that was quoted in the article. And in the context of a hugely inflated threat from China, what's going on in Ukraine, I think it is really not an unreasonable judgment to come to burden share, and that would be the term that I would use, with an extremely capable and sophisticated and very trusted regional ally to pick up one aspect of collection whilst your system focuses on something else. And I don't know if that is what has happened, but I just thought I would offer that as a kind of personal professional insight into why this might look a bit jarring, but actually, to my mind, this could have been a very reasonable and professional course of action. So then you talked a little bit about the Five Eyes conference, which was obviously a really big deal here for the UK and the UK security community. And I think the first time that the heads have gathered in that sort of format. So I think it really was a bit of a moment, and really good, I think, to see them addressing two really important aspects of national security risk at the moment. One, there's technology, and two, this era of state threat that we're in. And we focus a lot on the kind of conflict aspects of that kind of state-to-state activity. But there is this whole subset of activity that goes on below that, which some people call hybrid threat, or you could call it state threat, that is pervasive and extremely damaging. And I was really pleased to see the heads kind of focus in on some of this. So you mentioned they talked about the compromises of technology companies and the persistent attempts to steal intellectual property, equipment, all sorts of different objectives there. We have certainly seen that in the UK, and it's not just restricted to corporate entities. Academia is also in the sights here for China, particularly research institutions and so on. Many of these institutions, are not used to dealing with these types of risks, and so government is really having to shift posture to try and support civil society to adapt to this era of threat in the same ways we did in the 2000s with the threat from terrorism. And I think we're kind of some way there, aren't we? We've spent the last 10 to 15 years very focused on cybersecurity, and that is hugely beneficial now. But I think one of the things that perhaps we haven't turned our attention to quite so much and needs to come a bit more centre stage is some of the more human factors here, the sort of human methodologies to compromise companies and institutions. Insider and employee or contractor threat. Increasingly, companies are having to look at the types of commercial arrangements they're entering into, and the kind of due diligence they're doing around all of that is becoming much more important, as well as supply chain security and partnerships. I think also really becoming very important. And once you bring those two kind of planks of activity, cybersecurity and the kind of human side of it together, I think we will, that will be a much more comprehensive and effective approach. But it all speaks to this sense that we are in a different era now in terms of national security posture and how it's impacting our societies. I think probably that was it on your stories. I did have one additional story I wanted to kind of bring to the table, a sort of specifically a British one in a way, in that we hosted our artificial intelligence summit last week, and I just wanted to flag that because although it hasn't sort of generated anything of sort of huge summit-like importance in the same way as you might have on a climate summit, or there are no like sort of major initiatives coming out of this. But I do think it's an important moment and a bit of a sort of a junction in progress on the global discourse on artificial intelligence. So if we look back even 6 months ago, none of this was really out there in the public conversation, and I think the process of kind of instigating and organizing and hosting this has generated a lot more noise and a lot more media coverage, making it a lot more accessible to a broader audience. So although it's a bit of a baby step forward, I think it's a really good start. And we can already see that there are follow-ups being organised in Korea and in France as well. So I think that's really important and a really bold move to include China in that conversation. It would have been quite easy, I think, to only talk to friends in this. So I think that was quite a bold judgment and not unhelpful in recognising that some of the bigger, more existential risks can only be addressed really kind of collectively, globally. But there's so much more to do, isn't there? And we've both got elections coming up next year, so there are some AI crocodiles slightly closer to the canoe in terms of risk, and we're going to need to really grip some of that alongside some of these big long-term existential risks as well. So the conversation's moving slightly less lightning pace than the technology itself, but the summit, along with the president's executive order, I think are really very kind of significant moves forward. And I think probably that's all I wanted to say, Chris. So I will hand back to you.
Beth, your insights were invaluable. Thank you very much. Really appreciate your analysis. So I'm going to kick it over to Amanda, because our audience will have great questions that our team will curate. So over to you, Amanda. What are the hard questions you have for us?
Well, I'm gonna put a hard question to you, Chris, first of all, because I want to hear a couple thoughts from you on AI, because Beth mentioned she was going to talk about the summit, and every day I read something terrifying, and then my phone insists that I want to get on the wait list for ChatGPT, and I don't. Do you have any thoughts about AI and intelligence and what Beth has said about the summit?
Well, in a lot of ways, it's transformational. I mean, our governments are starting to wrap policy around these issues, and I think that's a step in the right direction. I did see some critical commentary coming out that the United States isn't doing enough on AI, and it's too little right now, but we're just grappling with this in terms of how it's going to, in some ways, maybe revolutionize capabilities for intelligence analysis. I think it's really important. So almost like the internet, it has both a positive and a negative. We've said that before at Spy Chats. I take a wait and see approach. I am trying to understand how policy is going to slow things down a little bit, but I don't know once the genie's out of the bottle in terms of intelligence capabilities. Entrepreneurs are going to keep developing. So I don't know. What I do have a strong opinion on is the fact that this is really going to give analysts capabilities that we've never had before, the ability to see things and coalesce things and help, but still, it's the individual human being that's going to have to make the final judgments based on those products.
I think you just answered a question that came in and about, is AI going to find those puzzle pieces that have not been found before? I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Beth.
I mean, yes. So I've been reflecting on this because I do think AI has the potential to offer different perspectives on and to augment human judgment. So some of those problems I mentioned around assumptions that we have based on kind of past events, or confirmation bias, or optimism bias, or actually bias from your own kind of societal background, whatever your unique individual perspective is. That's very valuable, but it is inherently hard to get yourself out of your perspective, and you can achieve that by having the right, we used in GCHQ call it the right mix of minds in the room, and being really deliberately inclusive to bring in the right perspectives. But that's also quite hard, and you quite often miss things. And I think technology and AI has the potential to perform a very non-human function here and bring us face to face with some of the limitations of our kind of human approach. And that's not to say that you allow it to make judgments and those judgments are right, but I think it has the potential to offer some really interesting new and non-human perspectives on some of the assessment challenges that we are taking on. And I know that we are already exploring some of that, and how AI and machine learning, what that can bring to the party in terms of assessment and analysis. And that's quite an exciting prospect, I think, which for somebody who's a sort of national security risk person, I'm usually on the miserable side of things, but I do think in capability terms, there's a huge amount here that we can exploit as a national security community.
In our analysis gallery at the museum, we give people a chance to explore some of their own biases, and it is interesting how you expect people to behave in certain ways, or countries to behave or in certain ways. So maybe AI can give us some neutral feedback that we can add to the puzzle. All right, I am going to tell the audience I am leaning into the questions that take advantage of Beth's background. So I'm weighing it in that way. I love this question. With regards to the Five Eyes, are we at peak intelligence sharing, or can improvements still be made?
So I think improvements can always be made on this. And it's about what forces those improvements. So again, if you look at the sort of the kind of cycles of risk that emerge at the start of the period of international terrorism, I think you only need to read the executive summary of the 9/11 Commission report to see how difficult it was for systems to get out of their silos and share. And it is even worse than that for state threat, because they tend to be teams in national security communities that are very compartmentalized necessarily, because the sorts of capabilities and sources they're dealing with are incredibly sensitive. So although we moved on quite a long way on terrorism, actually on state threat, that is sort of counterintuitive for intelligence professionals, and something we're really having to kind of break down in terms of Five Eyes sharing. And I think it's obviously moved on quite some distance, and it's not just Five Eyes, it's like-minded partners as well. And that's a great thing, but there is more to be done. And that usually comes either through really opportunistic operational work that you can do together, where it really is mutually beneficial to do that sharing, or because there is a forcing moment where, I don't know, for example, Salisbury poisoning, where you have a burning platform there, and it is really important that you share those perspectives and insights in order to meet the kind of challenge that's being posed. And I would just wrap one more challenge on that for the international community, and that is that, as with terrorism, we have to get some of this exquisite, super secret information out to the public in some form. So these companies that are dealing with, threats from China, or academics that are working on things that we really need in the national security community, we need to help those individuals understand the nature of that threat, and translate some of the knowledge that we have into a more kind of public format. So all of that is still, it's still early stages and ongoing, but I'm hopeful. We've done it before with terrorism. We can do it again with all of this. And the Five Eyes community is so close, and such a sort of valuable and kind of trusted resource, certainly in my career, that I'm hopeful that we will be sharing as much as we possibly can.
Yeah, and I would just add to foot stomp again on the idea of burden sharing, which is a great way of characterizing the idea of making the proper decisions for how you're going to array your collection assets to collect intelligence. And we did learn an awful lot about intelligence sharing during 20 years of a counterterrorism fight. We need to take that, and I agree with Beth, the premise of what she offered, and the idea that we have to expand some of those relationships and carry it into other realms. And I've made the point on different forums that counterintelligence is one of those areas that I think historically, countries have been very protective of sharing their counterintelligence information. And yet, when states like Russia are behaving like terrorists in terms of conducting assassinations or preparation for assassinations throughout Europe, which was widely reported early on during the fight in Ukraine, then we have to share that information, but we have to take it in different realms, counterintelligence information. And we also have to collectively look at opening up those partnerships. The Five Eye partners, that's sacrosanct. It works well. I was a beneficiary, as I alluded to, even not knowing Beth. We were working on the same problems in absolute lockstep. That really says a lot about these relationships. And we already talked about the Silicon Valley meeting that just took place. But the United States has also looked at what about broadening our relationships in terms of Japan, for example. So we have to continue to look at broadening these relationships. The world is far too complex to just have a Five Eyes relationships. That said, the United States is going to continue to have special partnerships with other actors in across the globe. Obviously, the United States has had a unique partnership with Israel for decades. All of that said, the United States has to continue, and the international community, to assess the requirements and look at broadening these partnerships. That's my perspective, based on first having worked with the Five Eyes and see how well that partnership works.
Chris, you mentioned Ukraine, and about that time, two different, somewhat similar questions came in on Ukraine. Someone wanted to know Beth's assessment of the UK's ongoing commitment to supporting Ukraine, and then a general question from someone else: are the Ukrainians making progress? Just little questions.
Well, I'll offer this, and I'd love to hear Beth's insights. I mean, I've been focused, and this is the problem, right? I've been focused an awful lot on what's happening with hostages and what's happening in Gaza, what's happening in terms of Syria, the strikes that took place in the last 48 hours, militia movements. While that's happening, we cannot forget in the West that there's still a fight going on in Ukraine. And I've taken my eye off it, so to speak, a little bit in the past couple of weeks. But I will say that a few years ago, I was asked, how do I see this ending? And I really think the analogy of a frozen conflict, although some folks don't like that, that's where we're moving to. There is, some would argue, and this is contentious, a bit of a stalemate. I think I would have liked to have seen some of the precision tools, some of the artillery, some of the ammunition, some of the tools of war get supplied to Ukraine earlier and sooner. That said, that didn't happen. I would also make the point that the Prime Minister from the UK was one of the first international actors on the ground in Kyiv. So I'll let Beth handle, or address her perspectives through the UK lens. But from my perspective, it's a bit of a frozen conflict right now. There's a bit of a stalemate. And of course, an election looms large here in the United States. I could understand from a Ukrainian perspective that there are concerns with decisions that could be made down the line by United States politicians and policymakers. All of that said, I would make the same point we've been talking about since the conflict broke out. This is an important conflict to counter Russia's malign behavior. We cannot take our eyes off this. Russia's threatened everything from their saber rattling regarding use of tactical nuclear weapons to significant and direct attacks against civilian populations, juxtaposed to what we're seeing with Israel. So this is indeed a scary situation, but we cannot forget there's a conflict ongoing in Ukraine. I don't know how it's going to end, but I do assess it as a bit of a stalemate currently. In the last point I'll make, I can't talk about who the actor was, but we have had Ukrainian seniors here at the Spy Museum, and I have an enduring faith in their ability to understand the importance, and they're in this fight for the long term. It's existential from a Ukrainian standpoint. I'll leave it there. I'm really interested to hear Beth's perspectives.
Yeah, I'm not a military expert, obviously, and like you, Chris, I've been very kind of focused on what's been going on in the Middle East the last couple of weeks. But from what I've read, the much anticipated counteroffensive looks to have been really challenging, and we are now going into a winter period, aren't we? Which all kind of speaks to your point of a very long-term sort of slow conflict that is going to require huge amounts of resilience and commitment by all of the partners involved. I think, as you say, the Ukrainian commitment to this is undoubted and unwavering, and from a kind of UK political perspective, as you say, we were very quickly in there supportive, and have continued with that stance through another two prime ministers since then. But actually, I mean, that just speaks to a consistency in that policy position. It has been pretty unwavering in the UK, and I think speaking from a personal perspective, I think that is incredibly important, because this is a conflict that is not about Russia and Ukraine, as you say, Chris. It is about defending democracy and about standing up for democratic values, and it's really crucially about not creating a permissive environment for characters like Putin and autocratic governments to, assume they have the license to behave in ways that undermine global security and have global impacts. And we've seen that repeatedly with the Ukraine crisis on energy, on food security, on migration, and so on. So we can't allow that sort of a sort of permissive approach. These countries need to see the challenge, they need to feel it, and as far as I can see, looking as a sort of outsider in now on the UK policy position, that does not look to be changing at all. So that's my take on it.
Now, you both mentioned becoming distracted is not the right word, but attention focus shifts to Israel, away from Ukraine. And Chris, you and I have talked about this. This distraction, does this then open the door to opportunities for domestic threats? The guest asked the question about domestic threats in the UK, while focus is on the Middle East. Does this open the door? Chris, we've talked about that in the US. Do you want to comment on how a focus abroad can lead to a lapse of security at home, or opportunities at
I think
home
it's
for
gonna
bad
lead.
actors?
No, thank you for the question. I think individuals will self-radicalize, and I think that's what, I don't want to put words in the director of the FBI's mouth, but that's what he's talking about. Individuals that will be animated by what's happening in Israel, and there'll be vulnerabilities in Jewish communities as well as Muslim communities, because we'll see an action reaction dynamic that is normative in these situations. It's sad, but that's what's going to happen. Individuals are going to be angry. They're going to go to their choice of a vehicle for where they get their media and news from. And in many ways, I hate those terms, echo chamber, but that's really what it is. They're going to hear these voices. They're going to go on to Telegram. They're going to get angry, and some population is going to react to that. Now, that is just individuals that are lone actors that will self-radicalize. We've seen that take place in a mosque attack in New Zealand several years ago, a horrific attack. We've seen that play out in synagogues here in the United States from individuals with far-right sympathies. So that will, at some level, it will increase. I think also there was and continues to be a trend of anti-Semitic and anti-Semitism. This will exacerbate that. And that's really what the director was talking about. And he hasn't seen this cacophony of threats since ISIS was crescendoing, since the height of ISIS several years ago. And then the caliphate went away, and that threat evened off, and we were worried about other threats. So I'm concerned. At the same time, I've said for the last 5 years since I left government, there is a tendency to overcorrect. And we weren't talking about jihadism. We weren't talking about the threat of terrorism. And we were reapportioning resources in the United States to focus on great power competition. I would ask folks to reflect on, where are we today? Frankly, the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, had just published, I think it was already printed in Foreign Affairs, an article basically saying things are relatively quiet and going very well in the Middle East. Look where we are today. Where are we in terms of countering a very muscular foreign policy from China? And then we just talked about Russia. But I am worried about the counterterrorism threat. But I also am optimistic that United States joint terrorism task forces, to include with foreign partners from the Five Eyes, are going to pursue leads, whether those threats are directed at mosques or at at other places of worship or Jewish community centers, they'll be aggressively investigated.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all of that, and I think very very sensible to place this as a challenge, in the context of this huge kind of quantum of risk that we have internationally at the moment. And we talked about optimism bias and normalcy bias. Well, we've felt like the terrorism threat has abated, and we want that to be the case, don't we? We all want that to be the case, and yet events like this so obviously have the potential to reignite and inflame some of that. And I know from a UK perspective, the Director General of MI5 certainly, I think at that Five Eyes conference, talked about the need to really closely monitor what is going on in terms of the potential for this to be a radicalizing influence in any way. And Hamas is seeking to exploit this, aren't they? They are very actively trying to control the narrative and to exploit the opportunities afforded by social media, in all sorts of different ways, in a very kind of cynical attempt to to promote that type of radicalization. So it's not just a kind of thing that is going on in the background. This is part of the intent here. I guess just from a kind of human perspective, a reflection that it is so awful that Jewish communities in the UK, a lot of reporting about it in the UK as well, and in the US, are feeling so vulnerable and fearful at a time when they are dealing with what is just an unthinkable kind of collective community trauma. To see, I drove home on Friday with my children and saw armed guards on the doors of the synagogue coming up from Georgetown. And it does just make you think this is a deeply, we can talk about this in the abstract, but these are kind of daily fears in the US and in the UK for people in our community. So I like you say, we've got to take this really seriously and not take our eye off the ball on terrorism alongside all of these other risks that our intelligence communities are trying to balance.
Interesting question. I had to look up exactly what the acronym stood for. So I like when I have to learn things during Spy Chat. What is Beth's perspective on the design and utility of AUKUS? So that's Australia, New Zealand, and UK in the suite of arrangements in the Indo-Pacific.
Oh, that's a very specific and difficult question. You did warn me I might get one or two of those. So, look, I mean, I think AUKUS is...
I had to look up AUKUS.
Well, at least I know that. So I think AUKUS is a really sort of major strategic shift, probably one of the biggest, although, it won't get as much kind of media attention or reporting as some other things. But I think in terms of a strategic partnership and shift, it is a generationally significant thing, in that you have the UK, Australia, and the US partnering to improve Australia's nuclear capability. And for very obvious reasons, this is extremely timely, and I think is a superb example of one of the strengths we have in our kind of Five Eyes relationship. If you look at China, it doesn't have very many friends. I mean, Russia, I guess, and North Korea. These are not necessarily friends that you'd be keen to have. But I think the strength in that allyship, both in kind of hard military capability and in intelligence capability and intelligence sharing, is one of our great strategic strengths and should not be kind of underplayed. I mean, the detail. I can't really talk to the detail of it for a whole number of reasons, partly because a lot of it is secret, and I wouldn't want to kind of stray into all of that. But suffice to say, it's a generationally significant program. I think it will have real global security improvements and will over time play a really important role in that kind of balance of power particularly in the Indo-Pacific, between China and the US. So I hope that answers a bit of your question without touching on anything that's too super secret.
You want to add anything, Chris? I mean,
I'm absolutely glad that Beth handled that question so adroitly.
Here is the kind of question I love, and it's not one I came up with. It is from the audience. Looking ahead to 2024, what 2 to 3 issues that we are not thinking about now may command our attention? And that was directed to Beth, but I'd like to hear from Chris, because I love these thinking questions.
You're going to me first, Amanda? I was pausing to make
Oh,
time.
sorry.
Sorry. It's hard for me to anticipate additional crises when I am really worried about the ramifications of ongoing problems with the Israel-Hamas war. But one of the things that we're concerned about, I mean, that's the royal we, is the idea of Iran. That could be the big question, right? Is Iran going to mobilize for war? Like, I don't anticipate that, but there is a possibility for a regional war. So right now, that's something that is concerning policymakers in multiple countries across the world. It serves no one's interest, and yet that's what I'm concerned about. So in other words, right now we have a relatively contained conflict taking place on the ground in Gaza, but you also have Houthis in Yemen, that are firing missiles toward Israel and toward, or at least on a trajectory, a path near U.S. ships. So I would offer maybe there's a positive outcome that isn't anticipated way down the line, and that is some kind of solution for the Palestinian problem. And I would like to note that there is the possibility that Arab actors will take the mantle at some point in time and recognize there's a responsibility to really contribute to long-term stability for the Palestinian population. So that's something that I think is possible. It might not be probable in the near term, but I do worry about Iran, and we still can't dismiss. So to answer the question more directly, now that I've had time to process the question, really challenging question, what if China moves on Taiwan? Maybe it's their opportunity in the next couple of years. That is another concern. So that's how I would answer the question.
Oh, it's a really cheery question, this one, isn't it?
But Chris managed to spin something positive in the middle of that.
I was very impressed with that. I'm
yeah,
not going to
I
do
was
that,
too.
to be clear. Chris has already mentioned Taiwan, which I think everybody is quite rightly very focused on. But I think more broadly than that, with US China, I think the sort of the lack of kind of a strategic space for a conversation, I think there are probably multiple ways in which miscalculations and escalations can happen in that relationship, and that worries me. The unexpected versions of that kind of worry me as much as the ones that people are pretty focused on. I'm going to throw you a sort of left field one here, the Balkans, which I started my career working on. And I don't know, Chris, if you've been sort of seeing these increasing sort of bits of reporting of tensions in the Balkans, which of course I'm fairly sure Russia will be both pleased about and fomenting in some way. But there is always the kind of dormant possibility for the Balkans to kind of ignite again. And I worry about that because that is, you know, on the European doorstep, and we obviously already have quite a lot geopolitically to be dealing with. And then I'm going to put a really, really cheery one in, pandemic, which, you know, we've just had COVID, haven't we? And we don't, again, psychologically, we don't want another one of these, but we are still due a 1 in 100-year pandemic flu. It is still top right impact likelihood in the UK's strategic national risk assessment, and something we absolutely have got to be learning the lessons from COVID on and doing the kind of hard work on the prep for now. And, you know, I really very much hope that does not happen in amongst all of these other really extremely significant risks that we're trying to deal with, but we have to remember that it could.
That is cheery, and but thank you. It is so great to have this perspective as we wrap up. Chris, do you have anything you want to say before I close out?
I'm hoping you're going to talk about our potential future programs and our season coming to an end. I just want to thank everyone. Our team is extraordinary. Beth, what a high note we're ending 2023 on, having you as our special guest today. We love our audience. We truly do. This is almost like a family. We have a lot of repeat folks that come on board and challenge us with amazing questions. So I just want to thank everyone and wish everybody a happy holiday season and a safe holiday season. I'll turn it back to you, Amanda, but thank you again, Beth, for joining us. And thank you to our Spy Museum staff for making this an amazing Spy Chat year. And I'm very excited about 2024.
Great conversation. I want to apologize to the many folks who asked questions. We could not get to all of them. I'm sorry about that. This will be on YouTube if you'd like to see it again, if you want to get further detail on what Chris or Beth said. We will not have a Spy Chat in December. We're going to let Chris have some holiday time with his family just this once. We will return in January. We have an interesting Homeland Security guest lined up. You'll see that on the website soon. And we will have a very interesting look at the Spy Museum on December 6th at a very notorious spy for Cuba here in the United States, Ana Montes. So just a few more programs this year, but we have a great year lined up. Love to see you in person or on a stream. And if you love this program and you want to consider making a donation to the Spy Museum, that would be amazing. It helps make us able to offer these events for free, to take care of our collections, and to do exhibit improvements. And if you can get to the Spy Museum, we've been doing some pretty cool new things that I can't talk about, but you could see them. So take care, everyone. Have a great Thanksgiving if you do it, and have a great November otherwise if you don't do American Thanksgiving. Take care.